It's a high-tech conversation.
And a low-tech topic.
Live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.
So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Bench Talk 101. I think we're carrying on with that Japanese tool trend from last week. And we're joined this week by Walter Sorrells, who's going to be talking about Japanese knife making, as I understand, or bladesmithing. So over to Kyle. Kyle's going to interview Walter, and he's going to introduce Walter as well. So over to you, Kyle.
First off, Sharnik, I'd like to say thank you for this, because I know that you usually run these, and it's a real privilege to be able to interview Walter Sorrells. I'm a big fan. Walter, if you could, as we're all makers here, and we've all chosen certain things that we've gotten into over the years, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what specifically drove you to Japanese bladesmithing?
Okay, so completely unqualified to be a knife maker. Have no background whatsoever in metalwork or really much of anything practical whatsoever. My career 1.0 was as a novelist. So I wrote, 30, 35 mystery and thriller novels. And so while I was, so backing up a little bit, I was also really into martial arts. I did karate and Japanese sword style and Brazilian jiu-jitsu and various things like that. And so anyway, I had this kind of long-standing interest in Japanese culture and Japanese martial arts and so on. So anyway, I was going to write a book. This would have been 20 odd years ago, in which the main character was going to be a swordsmith. And so, I felt like as a sort of research thing, I needed to kind of get some tangible feeling of what a swordsmith would actually do. So the first thing I did was I got a little piece of mild steel about 2.5 inches long, and a little tiny ball peen hammer, and I heated it up with a little Burns-O-Matic propane torch, which is like the torch you buy at Home Depot, and I could just barely get a little tiny bit of color in this thing, and I hit it on a rock, and the steel moved just a tiny little bit, and I just thought, oh, this is the best thing ever. And like probably everybody who's watching this immediately got seized with the bug of doing something that was going to be an enormous waste of money and energy in my life. And 20 odd years later, I'm still doing that. And I kind of slowly transitioned out of writing. Actually, I really didn't stop writing, as kind of my full-time occupation until, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, something like that. But I started doing videos. My interest was in Japanese swords. And so, I kind of quickly figured out some stuff about how to make hamones. And I just was getting all these people a long time ago, before YouTube and all that. People would write to me and ask me how I did my hamones. And so I got a little video camera and started videotaping some stuff, and turned out a series of videotapes. YouTube came along. I started posting little clips from these videotapes just as a marketing gimmick to, to flog these videotapes. And, this was in the very, very infancy of YouTube. So, I checked one day, and, 7 people had watched the video. And I checked 3 months later, and like 150,000 people had watched the video. And I can assure you 150,000 people hadn't bought, the videotape I was selling, the DVD. And so I was like, something's happening here that I don't understand at all. But, let me try making another video just for this YouTube thing. And, it just sort of caught on. And, so I've been making YouTube videos for, whatever it's been, 12 years now or something like that.
Now, I've always been interested in Japanese bladesmithing coming up. My grandmother is from Japan. We had a family sword, and it was fascinating to me. And as woodworkers, I see it a lot of time again and again with a lot of my friends. There's a certain obsession about perfection and quality of products. And in woodworking, you can make a lot without that quality of product or perfection and still have a very good product. But with something as precise and as much history as katana making, wakizashi making, tanto making, I mean, it's just been so chronicled over the years about this is, you have to follow these steps. What were some of the hurdles you had to overcome, tamahagane, the proper, there's 7 people who make a katana in Japan.
Right.
And then there's Walter Sorrells, who's doing it by himself, which I imagine is a very difficult process. So could you go over some of the,
So, I mean, there are kind of 2 aspects to that question. And one of them is just sort of the quality side of it. And, it really is a daunting thing because there is this well-documented tradition in Japan that goes back literally about 1,000 years. And so it's very easy, I think, to sort of feel like, oh, if I'm going to take this thing on, I guess you could almost get sort of paralysis by analysis or fear of, of going up against this great tradition and failing miserably or whatever. And I guess, the advantage that I have going into this is sort of twofold. One is that, as an amateur coming out of the West, I sort of feel like, look, I don't owe particular fidelity to that tradition. I respect it and it's really important, but I'm not trying to make a sword that exactly duplicates what a Japanese guy would probably feel obliged to do. I make some swords that are really as close to that tradition as I can get, and I make some that aren't, and I don't feel bad about doing either one. So, I think being able to sort of be at a 5,000 mile distance from that tradition maybe helps me a little bit in kind of relaxing into what it is that I'm doing. Now, that said, the challenge of learning in any sort of reasonable, non-BS way how to do what Japanese swordsmiths are doing, it's a very challenging thing. And I just happen to be one of those guys who, and obviously, the sort of bog standard way of doing it is to go to Japan and apprentice yourself to a traditional maker and spend 5 years there, whatever the number is, and absorb that tradition kind of organically. Obviously, I started doing this when I was in my 30s, and that was not an alternative for me. I had a family, I had a kid, and that's not happening. So, I turned on my own, resources of just infinite nerdiness, and I just, hoovered up every single bit of information that I could, that wasn't available, or that was available outside of that realm of going to Japan and being an apprentice. And so, I've done my best to learn as much as I can about the tradition and how to do swords in a traditional way. And I think I've been pretty successful at that. But, at the same time, I'm not trying to be precisely what a traditional Japanese smith would be trying to be. I'm in my own little category.
Absolutely. And when you watch those interviews by those national treasures in Japan, you note that after they're done with their apprenticeship is when they start to expand out into their own creative ways. And I think that's what a lot of people miss is once you've established that baseline to expand out and find creative ways to do your own thing. Now with the materials you're using, with a lot of your videos, I've seen you're not actually using Tamahagane, you're using 1095, things like that. What are some of the ways that you recreate the structure of the actual hardness? Do you actually use clay techniques, things like that, sand my? Could you go over, I know what you do, but for people watching, how do you recreate that metallurgical structure?
Okay, so I'm presuming that some of the guys on this, who are watching, come from more of a woodworking background. So I'm going to kind of start with a real ground floor, notion of what it is that I'm trying to do. In traditional Japanese swordsmithing, the steel is made in a smelter. It's smelted directly. And what comes out of the smelter looks sort of like a moon rock. It's a high carbon steel product that in no way resembles anything vaguely like a knife. And so the traditional Japanese approach, and this is, what most of us have seen on YouTube or wherever at one point or another, is just sort of break all this Tamahagane material up into little cookie shaped things, stack them up, stick them into a forge, heat it up to 2400 degrees or something in that range, and it's so hot at that point that the metal will actually stick together, and you smash it together, and then you forge it out and you fold it over and reforge it together, smash it, and just keep welding it. So there's this weld and fold process that yields a steel that has literally about 1 million layers to it, by the magic of whatever that is, the power of 2. So each time you're doubling it, the number of layers doubles. So, one of the, interesting aspects of that is that ultimately you get this sort of grain pattern that you wouldn't see in a in a modern homogeneous steel that is poured into a giant vessel and that just hardens in a big block. And so that wood grain is part of the traditional appearance of a Japanese sword. In addition to that, Japanese swords have welding schemes that are entirely different in intent and production from the welding of the basic steel. And what they'll do is they'll put sometimes a softer steel in the center of sort of like a hot dog in the middle of a piece of a hot dog bun, and they weld that together and forge that out so that you have a soft core and a hard outer skin. But there are like gazillions of different variants of that basic approach, which is to put a harder piece in on the edge and softer parts various other places. So you can recreate all those different kinds of approaches with modern steels, and none of them will have any of that grain pattern. Then there's yet one other distinctive feature of Japanese swords, which is that they're differentially hardened, meaning that they're heat treated in such a way that the edge will be hard and then the spine will be soft. And a lot of times people confuse the sanmai and various other welding schemes with differential hardening. So there are a whole bunch of different little trickerations that are used to make the classic Japanese sword. But the most obvious, visually most obvious one is this hamon thing, which is created by coating the back of the blade with clay, and then quenching it into water. And to quench hardened steel, to harden high carbon steel, it has to go from a very high temperature, roughly 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, to roughly 300 degrees in about a second. It's got to go down really, really fast, or it won't harden. It'll just soften up again. And so if you have clay on the spine, that'll make that back part of the blade soft and leave the edge hard, or cause the edge to be hard. And so that distinction in the it's basically the crystalline structure of the steel it can be made visible through your polishing methods. And that is that little, it turns into this little wiggly line that runs down the blade, and that's called a hamon. So the most obvious thing, to answer your, circling back to your question, the most obvious thing that I'm always going to do with any sort of, Japanese style blade is to differentially harden it. So I do put the clay on the spine and then quench, water quench it so that you end up with a hamon. As far as things like Kobuse and Sanmai and Han Sanmai and these various welding schemes, where you're welding different hardnesses of steel together, I don't find that there's any reason whatsoever to use those if you're just trying to make a functional modern sword. I've done it on a number of swords, and they don't seem to be any more or less functional than swords that are just made out of one big old piece of steel. So I know I'm giving an extremely long-winded explanation of this.
Oh no, I love it. I love it.
The final piece of this is the tamahagane, which we talked about earlier, which is smelting this steel and then forge welding it and folding. That process is something that I do sometimes. You can do that with a modern steel, and that's what everybody would typically call Damascus steel. You can take, say, 1095, which is a high carbon steel, and then 1050, which is kind of a medium carbon steel, just as a for instance. You fold those over, get maybe 200 to 500 layers of steel, and you can get a pattern that's actually quite similar to a traditional Japanese sword in appearance.
Absolutely.
It's not exact. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it looks kind of like it, and some people like it. So sometimes I do that. Again, there's no particular functional benefit as far as I'm aware, but some people like it. And then I do actually smelt tamahagane myself, and that's its own complicated little process. So I have this smelter that I've made, and we sit there for a day or so running charcoal and iron ore through this extremely hot fire, and eventually you end up with about 10 pounds of this crud at the bottom.
You do like the old Norwegian chimney stack style,
right?
Not an actual crucible with the woots like Al Pendre does,
right? So Woots is a whole different thing. Woots is not
right.
The tradition for, and again, I'll go back to ground zero on the explanation of this. Woots is a term for what sometimes was referred to,
Damascus
500 years ago as Damascus steel. In India and Central Asia, what's now Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and various other places, they would put iron and some maybe charcoal or something. We don't know exactly how they did it, but this is probably roughly how they did it, into a little crucible. They heat that thing up so hot that it turns to a fluid and incorporates all the carbon into that iron, and you produce a homogeneous block of steel. When you forge that steel out, when you cool that steel, it has to cool very slowly just because it's so big, and you get this crystalline formation known as dendrites. And this dendritic formation is visible much like grain in Japanese swords or whatever, but it's a whole entirely different thing. And so
Walter, yes. I apologize. I could go down this all day, and I was going to save some of those questions for the after, but I would be remiss for the people watching if we didn't also ask you about your Forged in Fire experience.
Okay.
And then we
okay.
can get back to the metallurgy afterwards.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I was on Forged in Fire. I came on to Forged in Fire, my particular episode as by far the most experienced smith of the group of guys, and I lost in a conspicuously ugly way. So, the thing about Forged in Fire is it is a game, it's a sport, it doesn't recreate exactly what you're doing in your own home shop, and that's just part of the reality of it. That's not anything negative about Forged in Fire. It's just, sometimes people look at Forged in Fire and they feel like they can learn all they need to know about a particular smith by seeing what they did on Forged in Fire. You got 3 hours to do something, and that's the way Forged in Fire works. And so anyway, it was a fascinating experience. It was my episode was filmed up in New York City at the Brooklyn Fireproof Studio. So the entire studio that you see on the TV is actually a set that's built inside this larger warehouse. So it's all kind of a big fakeroo. And I'm not saying the show is, I'm just saying that what you see there is actually a set rather than an actual interior building. So, the thing I walked away from that was most conspicuous about actually competing on the show is, when they came in there to do your briefing and all that sort of thing, they've got air conditioning going, and it's very comfortable, and it's this very pleasant environment. And they say, well, for audio reasons, we have to turn off all these air conditioners once the show starts. And so I don't know if that's actually true or not. I don't know if that's the real reason they have to turn them off, but the reality is they turn off the air conditioners, then they turn 4 forges on, and it's easily 110 degrees in there. I mean, it's unbelievably hot. And the biggest thing you're fighting really is the heat. I spent a good bit of time before the show, kind of practicing in the heat and practicing to be able to do, a certain thing in a 3-hour span of time and all that. And I had my foot to the firewall the entire time, and I was going along and I was feeling good. And about 2.5 hours in, all of a sudden it just like bam, it just hit me that just the amount of heat that that you're just overwhelmed with. And I was like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna make it here. But I said no. Actually, what I said is I am gonna make it through this, and I'm not letting up for one single second. So I just kept going. But I mean, I was so spent after that first day, and they shoot it in 2 days. So the handle making chunk of it is shot on one day, and then the other parts, the forging parts, shot the previous day. And so it's just unbelievably draining. And I mean, really, I was just like a noodle after I was done. I just kind of flopped down and just lay there.
Yeah.
But it was really interesting experience, and the guys that I competed with were super nice guys, and really enjoyed that aspect of it. You stay in the same hotel, you hang out with them, had dinner with them. All of them were great guys, and from that perspective, it was a fun experience.
All right. I appreciate all your answers. Shrenik, back to you.
I think before we move on to the questions, I don't think we'll do it justice. You were talking about something really interesting around metallurgy. I can't pronounce it. I can't say it.
Metallurgy.
There you go, metallurgy. I tried it. Do you want to carry on that?
Yeah. I'll just wrap that up as quickly as I can. So basically what I was talking about was woots, which is, the old style Damascus, you might call it. Anyway, you have these little dendrites that form in the metal as it cools. It's just a crystalline structure, but it's visible in the steel. You forge those out, and you have this cool pattern. And so there's been a lot of confusion about what really is Damascus steel and what the difference between Woots and, you know, what's generally referred to as Damascus now, which is really pattern welded steel. But I mean, you know, if there's a takeaway from all that, it's just the amazing ingenuity of these guys 1,000 years ago who, you know, had no lab tools, none of the measurement equipment that we have today, none of the metallurgical theory. They were just winging this stuff. And by, you know, scrupulously following what good old dad did when he put the things into the crucible or whatever it was that they did, these guys were able to produce, you know, steel of incredible quality long ago.
All right, thank you, Walter. Thank you very much, Kyle, as well. We're going to move on to the questions now. And if anyone doesn't know, hasn't joined before, doesn't know, if you pop your name in the chat, first come, first serve, I'll ask you to ask the question. So first up is Matthias. Here we go. Oh, replace the spotlight.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Walter. That was very, very interesting. It's a rabbit hole I am quite unfamiliar with in most ways. I mean, yeah, you sort of know generally that these things exist, and you're sure that there must be a fascinating tradition and all sorts of skills, etc., behind it. So I can't ask you any very intelligent questions about all of that because I know very little about it. But one thing that I think might interest everyone here, because we are woodworkers, so we work with sharp blades. So how do you get your blades sharp?
Yeah, so, you know, this introduces, I mean, if you want to talk about silly rabbit holes, sharpening is one of them. You know, I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me about sharpening is that there actually are different strategies for sharpening depending on what kind of tool you have, how thick it is, and most important, what you're going to be using it for. So the strategy that makes sense for sharpening, say, a kitchen knife is not necessarily the strategy that you want to use for a plane blade. And to me, you know, if you really want something super freaking sharp, a plane is it. And you know, those I sharpen on stones. But honestly, because I'm not really, I mean, one of the interesting things actually about about making knives is that really you're kind of a jack of all trades, master of none. So I have to be a woodworker to some degree. I have to be a metal worker to some degree. I have to be a metal smith to some degree. But I always have this psychological out of saying, well, I'm not really a woodworker, so I'm not gonna kill myself to be as good at this as I am at, you know, some other things that I might view as a little bit more of my core skills. So I pretty much every time I pick up a plane, I think I should be sharpening this. It's just not as sharp as I'd like it to be, or as I know I could make it, but screw it. I'm just gonna use it anyway. So anyway, in terms of plane blades, you know, sharpening on a water stone, or even you know, like a diamond stone or something like that, with some sort of jig that just allows you to you know, scrub it across there at the exact same angle every time. That's a great way to do it. And you know, I feel like people sometimes kind of overthink these things, but a jig is really really helpful for sharpening planes. And they really, you know, benefit by sharpening almost to infinite levels of sharpness. On the other hand, I mean, you know, I personally recommend that if you're sharpening kitchen knives, you just don't waste. I mean, the thing about sharpening is you can spend enormous amounts of time on it. And you know, this is one of these little philosophical things. You know, I make a living as a, you know, doing what a lot of people do as a hobby. And when you actually think about the dollars and cents aspect of it, you're always saying, is it worth my time to spend 2 weeks making a perfect workbench? Is it worth my time to spend, an hour and a half today sharpening tools when I could be making stuff that I can sell? And so every time I think about sharpness, I'm always thinking about dollars and cents and how much time's going down the rat hole, just trying to make something a little sharper than it needs to be. So, if I had any general prescription about this, it's be realistic about how sharp you want something to be. And just because some dude on YouTube, is able to make his, whatever it is, gizmo insanely sharp, doesn't necessarily mean you should make yours that sharp. Sharpen your tools to just the degree that you need them to do what you need to do, and then move on and start making real stuff. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, exactly. No, I wasn't thinking so much about the tools we use to make things, but the things that you actually do make. So the swords and the knives that you do make. So how sharp do you aim for them to be when they go out your door?
Good. Okay.
So and how do you get there?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on the actual type of tool that I'm making. My business, excuse me, my business is kind of divided in half. Half of my business is making Japanese swords, and half of my business is making modern sort of combative type blades or utility blades or whatever. And so the sharpening techniques are totally different. So with the Japanese swords, everything is, the final polishing is done, or final, how would you say, shaping is done with Japanese water stones.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're grabbing them and you're doing this kind of routine on a sequence of water stones. Now, this is, we were talking earlier about sort of, how much fidelity to the Japanese tradition one might have. The place, I mean, if there's one single place that I really depart pretty substantially, it's the final aspect of polishing. Yeah. In Japan, they have these little tiny stones that they scrub back and forth on the blade to achieve the final polish, and it's primarily cosmetic in intent. So yeah. I do that part of it with something with modern abrasives, mainly sandpaper, but also some other things. And so the swords are actually sharpest at sort of at the very end of the shaping phase, and then they start to lose a little bit of sharpness because of the way that I use sandpaper. And so then once I'm finally done and I've done the whole cosmetic thing, so the sword looks exactly the way I want it to, I actually go back with these little teeny DMT diamond stones, yep, and just sharpen by hand. And I'm just putting, basically a micro bevel on that last teeny tiny little bit of the blade. Yeah. And, I'm not trying to have it as sharp, say, as a plain blade would be or something. But obviously, I want to be able to cut paper without any snags and that sort of thing. So I want it to be very, very sharp. Yeah. I make all my swords to be used if you want to. If you want to hang them on the wall, that's great. But I want them to be sharp enough that you can cut through typical martial arts type targets. Yeah. Bamboo, tatami, whatever it is that people might normally cut with Japanese swords. Now, with the modern blades, what I do is I actually sharpen. These obviously have a different kind of bevel. There's a typical knife bevel with a little micro bevel at the end, and that micro bevel is far larger than, say, on the Japanese swords. Yeah. And so in this case, I bring the blade down to, say, quarter of a millimeter, maybe something like that. And then I use a belt grinder to put the final little micro bevel on there. That I will typically do to 220, maybe a little bit more than that. Uh-huh. And then I'll go to a really fine structured abrasive, like 40 micron, and I'll kind of smooth it out with that, and then I'll take it over to a rotary hone that I'll just hone the final edge on. So what I'm aiming for is, again, just something that'll, you know, cut through paper without any snagging, that'll shave hair off your arm. That's kind of what I'm aiming for.
Okay, excellent. That really answered my question. So thank you ever so much, and thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting indeed.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Matthias. We're on to Paul.
Hi, Walter. Thanks for the talk.
Hi, how you doing, Paul?
I'm fine. It's nice to have something a little bit different, because obviously, it's, with it being mostly woodworking we do, it's just nice to have something completely different. I just wondered, of the actual, just sort of like straight steels, what's your favorite to use?
So my favorite steel, for anything that uses carbon steel, anything that I'm forging, my favorite steel is W2, which is a water hardening, high carbon steel with a tiny bit of vanadium in it. As far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong about this, but I don't think anybody is routinely producing this commercially anymore, or if they do, it's only in very small batches. So it's pretty hard to get your hands on now. When I first got started, they had pretty much stopped making W2, but it was a very, very widely sold steel a long time ago. And so you could find old stock of it lying around all over the place. Failing that, 1095, 1086, basically just high carbon steels are what I would typically use for you know, any kind of forging. On the other hand, for my modern knives, I use all stainless steel, and I typically use S30V. I've also used S35VN and some other things. But, you know, I think a lot of people kind of over obsess about steel. Though, if there's one takeaway I would give you about steel choice, it's that the most important thing is not the quality of the steel, quote unquote, but the quality of the heat treatment that's given to it and the appropriateness to whatever task you're trying to do with it. I mean, just as a for instance, anything that is not going to have the edge shocked a lot, and a plain blade is a really classic example of that, can be tempered to a relatively hard and relatively brittle level in a way that a utility knife shouldn't be, because you're more likely to break it if you do it that way. Sure. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So I mean, with a utility knife, if you had it really, you could literally snap it if you over hardened it.
Right.
Because I know that a lot of people will split wood by putting it in and twisting it.
Right. And you know, the way that all hardening is done is there's a hardening process which should bring it to its peak hardness. It should bring the steel to a point of being as hard as it possibly can be. And then you temper it by heating it again to a much, much lower temperature. Typically, it depends how, you know, on the steel, how you do it. And it's really that secondary hardening or secondary heating process where you heat to a much, much lower temperature that determines the hardness and brittleness and most of the working qualities of the steel.
Yeah, that's great. I'll move on and let somebody else ask questions anyway. Right. But thanks very much for that. Good. I do plan at some point to make a forge, but I've been told no by the missus.
You're thanks, not the
Paul.
First.
Paul, I'll have a chat with her.
No, don't.
I'm joking.
Project.
Okay, on to Mitch.
Hi, that was a fantastic talk. Thanks very much. I was just wondering whether or not you had any blades that you could show us and perhaps give us an idea of how long you spend making them.
Well, you know, I was instructed beforehand that I should have some little display items, and of course I completely forgot and left them all in my shop, which is a long walk from here, so I won't have anything to show. But so the issue of how long it takes to make these things is completely all over the map. But it's of quite a bit of interest to me because you know, if you sell anything, you're always chasing, you know, like, okay, how much time did I put into this thing to justify, you know, what I sort of feel like I ought to charge for it, or what the market will bear, or whatever. As far as I'm aware, I probably have never made any money whatsoever making katanas because they're so unbelievably time consuming. I mean, you know, there are Japanese guys who charge 50 grand for a sword, which, you know, seems insane, but when you see how much effort goes into them, you know, even at that rate, those guys aren't getting rich off of it. So anyway, to answer the question, you know, on my production blades, which are made, you know, I use a CNC machine, and a lot of, you know, I do the final grinding on a belt grinder, and, you know, there's a lot of machine work involved in it. I'm still probably putting 4 hours, you know, into the blade, so maybe even more than that. So there's a fair amount of labor even in a standard production knife. But the Japanese swords, it makes me cry every time I think about how much, you know, energy I put into these things, how much time. My guesstimate would be, let's just say, for instance, that I'm making a blade from Tamahagane, which is, you know, the most complicated thing. It takes me about, you know, 2-3 days to prepare for a smelt. Then it takes an entire day to do the smelt. And then it takes another day to process the stuff that I got from the smelt and just break it down into something that I can start to begin to think about using. Then you stack that up and you fold it, you forge weld it. And so to get one little bar of steel, I put another 3 days into forging. Now, if I want to make a katana, I need 2 of those bars. So I'll stack, after I've produced 2 of these little bars, each one taking an entire smelt, I'll take 2 of those and then I'll forge, you know, and weld those things repeatedly, usually another day or 2 of forging. So by now we've done 2 smelts that basically took a week apiece, and we've put probably, you know, 7 days at the forge into it. And I now have a piece of metal that most people would look at and say, boy, that's a really crappy crowbar. I wouldn't even use that to try and pry a door open. So then once you've got that little bar of steel, you have to forge it out. The actual forging of the katana, the part that you sort of think about when you see some guy, you know, wailing away with the hammer, producing something that's actually shaped like a sword, that really only takes about a day or 2. And then I'll go to the belt grinder and do some very, very rough shaping on it. And then I'll use hand files, and I'll spend maybe another, and that's usually, let's say that's a day. So now I'll use another day, probably 2 days of hand filing. Now we've got the thing shaped enough that we can clay harden it. So I'll, you know, spend a couple hours putting clay on it. And then I'll spend about 45 minutes to, you know, an hour. Well, you know, you got to set everything up and all that sort of thing. So let's say half a day to heat treat it. So that's that thing where you heat it up and you plunge it into water and the whole blade curves and, you know, super magic happens. The spirit of the gods enters the blade and all that kind of stuff. So now you have something that's approaching looking like a sword. So at that point, I'll go back to the belt grinder, again, refine the lines just a little bit and kind of bring it down to more or less an edge. So now you're ready to do the hard work. And that is where you do the hand shaping on Japanese waterstones. So many more days, you know, you just do that until your arms start to fall off and you quit and go back. And usually drinking is a good solution after you've done that for a while. So some number of days are involved in this scrubbing around on Japanese waterstones. And then there's some final, processes that I do to make it look pretty, sharpen it up, and now you've got a blade that looks like a Japanese sword and performs like a Japanese sword. And you haven't made the scabbard, the handle, any of that stuff. So I would say just that part of it right there is probably 200 hours. Guessing. It might be 400. It's a crazy amount of work.
See where the prices come from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks very much.
You bet.
Thank you very much, Mitch. I look forward to watching a video of you attempting the same soon. On to Stephen, if I can find you, Stephen. There we go.
There we are. I had a number. What is your estimated hour cost versus your profit that you put on top of it?
I really couldn't even begin to tell you. It's so. I mean, I just sort of have to say at the end of the year, here's how much money I walked away with, and realistically, I get about half of my income from the internet and videos and all of that sort of the IP piece of my world, and half of it from knives. And if I were spending 8 hours a day making knives, then I would expect obviously for that to generate 100% of my income. But because I split it in half and those two kind of overlap, it's really almost impossible for me to say exactly how much what my cost of labor sort of is in all this. And of course you're carrying overhead on all of your tools and all that sort of thing.
Right.
It's a terrible way to make a living, let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, I'm an industrial engineer, and so process and cost, etc., are some of the things that I used to look at before I retired.
Right.
But the reason why I ask that is when you're making your decision to go this way or that way as far as process, if you understand what your average cost per hour is with or without profit, either way, the decision making is the same. Is buy the piece of equipment that will reduce the number of hours, or put the time in and make it yourself.
Right.
And so that was the reason why I asked, because I assume that your swords are, the most expensive sword that you make, you've got probably a month of time in it. And then you need to tack on top of that your profit. What you need to make a profit in order to cover all these other fixed and variable costs you've got.
Right.
I'm just trying to get into your business mind. Because if you don't know the answer, you need to figure it out, because it will help you making some of your decisions on how you do things or what your price is.
Let me walk you through my thinking on this, because I'm a very analytical person, and I like reducing things to numbers, and I like being able to kind of process engineer something as opposed to just winging it. And what I have determined is that the cost of figuring that out is actually pretty substantial in and of itself, because what I do, almost every single project that I do is in some way or other one-off. And so, I have kind of this set of things that I do and this set of things that I do. And so, when I first got started, I really did try to get, some purchase on what exactly it was costing me to do things, and, what was a rational way to do it. And I ultimately found that I just ran into walls of, data collection, of, making a reasonable assumption about how to allocate, fixed costs against what I was doing. ultimately, I just said, screw it. I don't care. I can't really figure it out, especially with the most expensive things that I do. And so I'm just going to do this stuff the way that I want to do it, in a way that is fun for me. And I managed to do that and still pay some bills. And you know, that's just kind of where I landed. When it comes to my modern production, you know, type knives, I have a much better sense of, you know, where those costs are and, you know, what it costs me to do different things. And, you know, part of it is that you have to deal with what the market's willing to pay for whatever it is that you make. So just because you figure out what your costs are doesn't mean you can necessarily charge in a way commensurate with that.
Well, yeah, I understand. The thing though is time is money, and that adage goes way back.
That's absolutely.
And if you've got, let's say, if you make 50 knives, you make more money making 50 knives than you make in one sword.
Absolutely.
And so therefore your pricing would reflect that. And that was the primary point of the message. Now, as to metalworking, the southern part of India is actually the origin for what we call Damascus steel today, because they found this is a couple thousand years ago, they found a massive nickel meteorite, and they were able to mine that meteorite and then sell it to Damascus, to Japan and China for their sword making. And that's where you get the two steel process. They learned how to do it to a point where their swords, I think they were 4 or 5 feet long, but you could take the tip of the sword and bend it to the hilt and release it, and it would regain its shape. And when Alexander the Great invaded India, the reason why he was met with such ferocity, and the India continent beat the heck out of him to a point that he died shortly thereafter from wounds and diseases. But it was that sword, and they have found a couple of those swords today, and while the handle material is rotted away, the swords have no oxidation whatsoever. And it was because of the lamination of the blade. It had to be hard where you fought, and it had to be soft and flexible so that the hard steel, which was exceedingly thin, had some support with the mass. And that goes along with chisels and plane blades today. It's you know, the most successful ones are the ability to have minimal maintenance, not rust too much, but when you're pounding on it like in a chisel, then you have the edge will stay sharp and do its work, but the main body is wrought iron, so it gives flex. So when you're building your swords and your knives, you have a variation on that theme. And I like your point that the tool or knife or edged whatever that you're making requires different levels of sharpness. And so when you're making your swords, or you've done your research in your swords, did you notice that, say, the areas that were from the handle to maybe 2/3 of the way down to the edge were not as sharp as the very edge, say the third of the length of the sword?
Well, in traditionally made Japanese swords, the little, you know, sort of the portion of the blade that's adjacent to the handle is not sharpened at all, at least initially. It's left a little bit thick.
Hand.
Right. And that part, over time, that's a provision for sharpening, so that over the, you know, years as it's sharpened and sharpened, you don't lose the geometry of the blade, and then the rest of the blade is kept quite sharp.
Okay, I'm done.
Right.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Just leave things out there.
Right, we're on to Stephen. Sorry, not on to Stephen. We've just gone from Stephen on to Eric.
Hi, Walter. Listen, that was a very interesting indeed. One of the things that my sort of perception of blacksmithing and metalworking and to make tools like this is that it's quite sort of low tech. It's very traditional. You're doing the same things that have been done for hundreds of years. Is that still the case? Is that the case for you, or do you have a lot of sort of high tech stuff, or are you still doing temperature by color in a sort of badly lit workshop, or have you got fancy gauges that will tell you exactly what temperature the things are at?
The answer is yes. I'm kidding. What I mean by that is kind of all of the above. Depending smith to smith, some people sort of intentionally try to strictly use techniques that would have been found, for in whatever little realm that they're interested in. Other people aren't interested in that at all, and they'll go as high tech as they can. I'm kind of in the middle. I mean, when I'm working on my Japanese blades, I don't use a lot of high tech stuff. I am gauging the temperature by eye, and I do it in a very dark space so that I can have a good kind of visual perception of what's happening to the temperature of the blade. Now, when I'm doing my modern production type stuff, that's much more high tech. I'm using temperature controlled furnaces and, engineered quenching oils and all that kind of stuff. And so, that's just its own little world. I'm not a bigot about any of that. I really, kind of going back to my previous question, a lot of times I really do make decisions that you might argue are a craft decision or a business decision, or, that the sort of decision tree that I ought to go through would be X or Y or Z. And I just make the decision tree is it fun? I mean, that's my whole decision tree on a lot of things. Is this a fun way to do it? And it might be fun today, and then tomorrow I might do it a completely different way.
Oh no, that's great. Yeah, no, I mean, I went on a weekend course and made three knives, and I really enjoyed it. But it didn't steal me away from woodwork though. But I've still got the knives. They're still good.
Well,
thanks very much, Walter.
Absolutely, and I mean, to me, this is one of the great things about doing crafts is there. If you were making chairs in the Middle Ages, then all of your decisions were based on, this is my family business. I have to do it this certain way. The market expects me to do such and such. I'm living over a shop that says chair maker, and so that's what I got to do. But today we're making them, we just fill our shop with whatever tools we feel like filling them with. And, most of the people that I know, even though they may be interested in how much money they make or the kind of subtle things about the craft, most of them are just saying, hey, what's the funnest thing that I could do today?
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I've just thought of something else. I've done a little bit of metalworking. I might do a little bit more. If do you do any woodworking other than just making wood for a wooden handle for something, or do I can't remember what they're called, the bits that go on either side of a folding knife?
Scales, yeah. I do some, but I mean, and this is actually something that I'm really excited about with my new workshop. I've just moved from this garage basically that I've been using for the last 20 years to a much larger space. I literally had my table saw hanging from a chain hoist in my garage. So if I wanted to do woodwork, I had to spend 15 minutes taking the table saw out of the eaves out of the rafters and putting it on the ground. And so I wasn't able to do as much woodworking as I wanted to do. And so I'm really looking forward to kind of sinking my teeth into woodworking a little bit more than I have in the past.
All right, no, that's great. So we'll hopefully see more of you in future weeks here. This is a great learning spot. I've learned so much from this crowd. You know, there's some really
Awesome.
good talent here.
Great.
All right, thanks very much, Walter. I'll let
You
someone
bet.
else go.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Eric. I am going to jump on for a question before we go back to Kyle for his last question. So, Walter, you talked about W2 steel, which is a water quench steel.
Right.
You haven't mentioned A2 steel yet, which is also water quenched, I believe. But the actual water quenching process, is it more difficult than oil quenching?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I have a short answer and a long answer to this. And as you know, after spending an hour with me, I favor the long answer over the short one. But you know, the short answer is that if you quench anything in water, there's a good chance that it'll crack. And so there's some little tricks that you have to use to, you know, ameliorate the violence of that quench into water. Even if you use a lot of trickeration, it can still happen. So, you know, if you have the choice to oil quench something, you always want to oil quench it. It's built into the type of steel. For those of you who haven't done any screwing around with tool making, the heat treating process of every kind of steel is unique to that kind of steel. And so you have to really understand, you know, probably the single most important thing that you can do when you're making tools is to understand how that particular kind of steel is heat treated. And, you know, so A2, I mean, actually, the A stands for air. It is theoretically an air hardening steel. But, you know, some people water quench it, some people oil quench it. And so it depends on the thickness and exactly what you're trying to do with it and all that.
Okay.
If you have the choice though, always water quench. I mean, always oil quench.
Okay. Thank you very much. Back to Kyle. There you go, Kyle.
Walter, first I'd like to say thank you for your time today.
Hey, my
I know you're a
pleasure.
busy man. I actually started off in ornamental blacksmithing, taking classes down at this local museum. And one of the differences between blacksmithing, metalworking, and woodworking is that with woodworking, it's very easy to get to the fundamentals of why things do things. Whereas with metalworking, there's scientific fields dedicated to metallurgy and thermodynamics, and it's become one of my problems that I can't get to the fundamental of why something does something without getting a PhD in metallurgy. And being someone who has 20 years doing this, I mean, I literally, like right here, I have a grad level book on metallurgy, and I understood the first page that said welcome to my book, and after that I was lost. How far down the rabbit hole would you say to somebody who's just starting off in bladesmithing should you go to understand the quench process, austenite, carbide alignment, dendritic formations, face centric, body centric? You know what I'm talking about.
Go down that rabbit hole as far as you can possibly stand. You know, everybody has their own tolerance for nerdy information accumulation. I have a pretty high tolerance for it. Some people don't. So, you know, I would really say if you like nerding out on stuff, then nerd out on the metallurgy as fast as you can. It will never be wasted energy. However, if you're not that guy, and a lot of people aren't, a lot of people just want to go in, work with their hands, do something, and not, you know, spend all night, you know, doing equations on the blackboard. And so if you're that guy, just be honest with yourself that is who you are, and try and find out how some other dude did it. You know, find somebody who's good at what they do, and what was their process for a particular kind of steel. You know, one of the afflictions of bladesmithing is that you know, people tend to be chasing the latest steel, the coolest steel. Oh, I heard this steel, you know, you can fold it in half and you can do this and you can, you know, it'll cut, you know, machine gun barrels in half, all stuff. Every steel has its limitations, and it's more, you know, it's way more beneficial to find one steel and really master it than it is to every 3 months or every, you know, every time you go out to the shop, try a new steel. Because when you do that, you never get anywhere close to the real capabilities of that steel.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you both. I forgot I was muted. God, that's the first time I've done that in a very long time. Okay, I'm going to remove all the spotlights, and this is our time to raise a toast and say thank you, Walter. Thank you to Kyle as well for the for interviewing Walter, and raise a glass and say cheers to the bench.
Yeah. My pleasure. I would have brought a drink if I had known this was coming.